Welcome everyone once again, especially those who have just joined us. As Razi mentioned, I'm Farwa Aamer, and this afternoon we'll delve into a subject which is extremely pressing for our generation and for the generations to come: climate change. The Asia Society is hosting this exhibit, Coal and Ice, which I hope many of you have had the chance to visit. And if you've not, I sincerely urge you to visit the exhibit because it offers a gripping visualization of the kind of situation we are facing in terms of climate change across the globe, across Asia. For South Asia in particular, whether it's the devastating floods, to extreme heat waves, to droughts, the region is no stranger to the wrath of exchanging climate. But amid all of this chaos, there is hope for transformation, adaptation, and resilience. So let's explore and in the process, maybe try and embrace the storm, shall we? And to do that, I am delighted to be in conversation with these two esteemed experts and practitioners and overall just wonderful people, Shazia Rafi and Saleem Ali. So without further ado, I'm really grateful for your time. I must say this, get bashing later for not welcoming you properly. So if I could just ask both of you this question. You have years of experience researching, studying the different facets of climate change. Can you paint a picture for our audience here in terms of what climate change looks like for South Asia today? And why does it demand our utmost attention? If I could come to you, Saleem, first, and then we can go to you, Shazia.
So climate change in South Asia, for those of us who visit regularly, the first most visible sign is the atmosphere. And we often think about the pollution in Lahore, the city, which is unfortunately in the last 2 years has been rated the most polluted city in the world, one of claims to fame which we shouldn't be proud of. And that has to do with particulate matter pollution and so on. And one might say, well, that has nothing to do with climate change. That's our own behavior and so on. But actually, there are increasing scientific studies which reflect that climatic change patterns are also contributing to what we are seeing there. So we see that, of course, the dystopian view of South Asian cities that is often projected in many documentaries is closer to reality than we might have hoped. So that's one part of it. The other part, so there's the air and then there's the water, of course. And with water, we often come across these vistas of flooded communities. You see these images of entire parts of Sindh and Balochistan particularly, which were inundated by flooding. And we have also in fiction, writings which have talked about flooding in South Asia. Amitav Ghosh and other writers have been exploring these issues. But that fiction is increasingly becoming non-fiction, sadly. So that's kind of the vision that we see, but there is hope also. So I would say the other part of it is I travel around Pakistan and I see solar panels increasingly on roofs. So that's the other side of the story, which is very promising as well, that you have greater level of awareness in terms of at least the Pakistani middle class around energy usage. But that has come about due to necessity because of load shedding and so on. So you have this unfortunate situation where you've got a spiral downwards, but you also do have some glimmers of hope. And I hope that we can build on that further.
No, thank you very much. And that's correct. With Pakistan, we see these different impacts and sort of repercussions of an exacerbating climate change. But you see that similarly all across the region as well. And we would come to that later. But I want to move on to you now, Shazia. I believe you also have some slides for us.
Yeah, if they can perhaps begin with the first slide.
You try clicking?
Should I?
Yeah.
Right there. Okay. So first I would like to begin With a land acknowledgement. We are sitting here and having this discussion about South Asia in Mannahatta, land of the Lenape Nation, also known as New York. I'd like to take it in a more broader, beyond South Asia sense, because climate change and air pollution are two sides of the same coin. As you see from the graphic, air pollution is both a measure of, contributor to, accelerator of climate change. The same carbon emissions that speed up global warming are making our air quality worse. And unlike climate change, air pollution is easy to measure. It is measurable in real time. It's as if you can take the temperature of the planet by measuring the AQI. So for researchers, policymakers, the individual who's planning a trip somewhere, it's a very easy thing available on an app. Pollution also knows no boundaries, air pollution in particular. Hazardous air from one area can reach another. We in New York experienced that last summer when, the fires of Canada, just with the change of wind direction, suddenly had New York as the world's most polluted city for 3 days. South Asia, of course, is another matter. And I think that is something that you can see very clearly here. This is an air pollution map of South Asia. It truly is the ground zero of air pollution globally. So of the world's 42 most polluted cities, 39 are in South Asia, and 3 of them are in Pakistan, 1 in Bangladesh, the rest in India. Now, I want to take you back a little because South Asia has also contributed to what will be the solutions. So in 2013, it was the Pakistan delegation of parliamentarians which put forward the right to clean air at the United Nations and put it into the resolution that became the basis for the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 and eventually the 3 targets and indicators on how do we get to reduce the air pollution, reduce the carbon emissions. This is the other side of the Paris Agreement on climate change, which sets a global target on global warming and a total number of carbon emissions that we are to reach. But the SDGs are the ones that lay out how we are to reach that global target. And South Asia has a lot to contribute in this area. I'd like to say a little more about that. If it might be easier for me to sort of lay it out and then deal with questions later in the Q&A. So when we look at air pollution deaths, there's about 9 million annually. This is the impact of climate change on human health, which also includes air pollution. And we can come back to it in the Q&A. But when we look at air pollution deaths, they have a bell curve. They rise as countries move from low income to lower middle income because they're industrializing and they're using the dirty path to development because that is cheaply and easily available. And then as they move to upper and middle income and higher income, the air pollution levels go down, the health-related hazards related to them go down. One of the reasons is that you have better clean energy, you have better technologies available. The other is you've got better health systems that are able to then ensure that those who end up in hospital survive. So South Asia has a challenge on both. Both in terms of how we are industrializing using dirty technology and also our healthcare systems are not able to ensure that those who end up there will survive. Reversing all this pollution takes an enormous amount of money. And that's where the biggest challenge for South Asia lies, because our economies are very strained when it comes to both the negative impact of air pollution on their GDPs and how they can get to the other end. So when you look at the GDP impact on South Asian countries of air pollution, for example, in India, it's 7.8% negative hit to the GDP. That, if you apply to last year's GDP, is $291 billion leaking out of the Indian economy. In Pakistan, for the same year, it's about $20 billion leaking out of the economy, much larger than what we are asking the international community for in terms of aid. So these are the challenges. We'll talk about the solutions later.
Thank you very much. This is extremely thought-provoking, but at the same time, I was hoping that I had two faces, not figuratively, literally. So I have one at the back, so I could see the slides, which I missed on, but I hope you are getting the visuals along with what Shazia just very meticulously explained. You know, South Asia's crises, of course, whether we're talking climate change from the sense of water, whether air pollution, all of these challenges that we've talked about, they are transnational in nature. So nature knows no boundaries, and that is something that the region has been experiencing. If there is a shared challenge, it is climate change for the region. There are very many others, but one that is evidently right in our face to experience on a daily basis by the population of this region, which is almost like 1.9 billion and growing. With that in mind, I would love to get your thoughts on, on the role of partnerships. Whether it's partnerships with a country partnership with multilaterals, with academia, with CSOs, with international financial institutions, but also how do we mobilize governments to work together in tandem and cooperate, so sort of create this collective rhythm to climate action. So if I could get your thoughts on the Saleem first, and then we're coming into you, Shazia.
This is something which really confounds me as a writer as well. And, apart from my academic writing, I write for Forbes regularly on sustainability. And one of my recent columns, I mentioned this fact that the environment used to be an area where people used to come together and cooperate. Republicans and Democrats in the US, they actually collaborated on environmental issues. The EPA was started by Richard Nixon, who was a Republican. You had Newt Gingrich, who was one of the more obnoxious Republicans. He wrote an entire book called Contract with the Earth. It received a cover endorsement from E.O. Wilson, the legendary ecologist at Harvard. So now what we see is that the environment has become a fracturing issue, especially in the US. And in South Asia, the interesting thing is that before SARC was formed, people know about SARC? How many of you know when I say SARC? Okay, some hands up there. South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. This is our regional cooperation organization for South Asian countries, India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, headquartered in Kathmandu, Nepal, which is easy for Pakistanis to go without a visa as well, perhaps one of the few countries where we don't need a visa. So SARC was established in the 80s, but actually 2 years before SARC was established, there was an organization specifically for environmental partnerships in South Asia established called SASIP. I'm sure most of you have never heard of SASIP. It's a South Asian Cooperation for Environmental Protection organization based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. So the idea of environmental cooperation in South Asia has been around and predated even SARC, but it has not been operationalized because sadly, the environment in our part of the world is what we call low politics. It's like जी वो mid-level bureaucrats हैं उनको बात करने दें, civil servants हैं जाके चाय वाय पी लेंगे, but they're not going to bring it to the level of high politics. And that's the sad part of it. So that's what we have to work on. We have to move the environment from low politics to high politics of defense and finance and so on, so that the environment ministry becomes a coveted ministry, not just the finance ministry and the defense ministry. And that was sort of a glimmer of hope. In the last government, there was more interest in that. But let's see where we go. So that's where we are at. We have organizations. We need just the leadership and the political will.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for bringing up the dysfunctional and almost zombie regional frameworks that South Asia unfortunately has. What a wonderful region, remains to be the least integrated in the world. And even though one would think that climate change is a shared challenge and it'll bring people together, it has become increasingly divisive, especially when it comes to water politics, which we can go on talking about forever. But I also want to hear your thoughts on this, Shazia, in your own words, especially with regards to multilaterals. In your own words, you've done many a tawafs of that organization through the past decades. So love to hear from you.
So I think South Asia is that divided family that is unable to sit together at the same dinner table.
Yeah, we're not invited for Thanksgiving.
So, yeah. So I think in my organization, in my previous organization, as well as this one, we work with parliamentarians and at that high level of politics. The only way that we've been able to work in the countries of South Asia is by doing the work on the same blueprint, but at the national level in each country. So it's as if we are building the same building with the same blueprint in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. Sri Lanka and Nepal, unfortunately, are not involved very much in the work on climate change and air pollution, despite having those institutions based there. And that is the only way that almost putting all three of these countries on the same path with the same SDGs that were negotiated by the parliamentarians in 2015 on clean air and with the climate goals. So my approach to it is that they're never going to sit together, but if in each of their countries, they're working on the same renewable energy bills, they're working to pass the same electric vehicle policies, they're working to bring in the same transitions to green economies, they're working to de-risk and guarantee private sector investment into loss and damage and other capital investments on climate, that is good enough. I don't see in the near future, either in what is going to come as the elected government of India or what is there in Pakistan, any kind of ability to cross that divide. There is more work going on between Bangladesh and India on the Ganges and the Ganges Delta region. But if you take the whole Indo-Gangetic plain from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal, there is very little movement forward. And it's a pity, because one of the things that I think is most interesting when you come to this work is that the experts and the private sector have already showed us that green investments, moving to a green economy, is a win-win in terms of profit. $2 invested in the green economy will give you $7 of a return. In almost every sphere, whether it comes to employment, whether it comes to improving the air, whether it comes to improving your economic GDP, and yet we are unable to push across that hurdle. And the big hurdle in South Asia, unfortunately, is that we are a region of what in Pakistan is popularly called the elite capture. And we had this in this country too. The EPA had to struggle against industrial hurdles, because in any transition, the investments requires has to include the losing industries who need to be compensated so that they don't continue to block the transition. Labor has to be retrained. It has to be relocated. It's the same issue with coal in Pennsylvania and solar in Arizona and Nevada, as it is in Pakistan, as it is in India. And I think that's where we got to do more work.
So we're not at all so different although there's this whole conversation which, again, we'll have to take it another day, the global north and global south divide on this. But it's really interesting, at the same time heartbreaking, to see the state of affairs. It's a very reactionary policy making that takes place in the region, where all you see is what is there in the short run, and long-term policy planning, unfortunately, with climate change and beyond, it doesn't work. But all the regional all the regional member countries for South Asia, the heads of state, if they could just read Rumi, and we'll just say, out beyond the field of right and wrongdoing, just all of you meet there, work this stuff out, But it's hard because I'm sure they don't read Rumi. Maybe that should be our next thing on the agenda when we do climate diplomacy. But I'm very cognizant of our time, and I want to be able to have you guys ask questions and be a part of this conversation, because I'm sure there's a lot that's there in all of your heads. We are indeed at a literary festival, and I do not want to miss the opportunity of discussing the role of art, culture, and storytelling in mobilizing climate action and building awareness around this extremely important subject. Especially, you know, for this culturally rich region like South Asia. So, Shazia, why don't we start with you this time? We'd love to get your thoughts on.
So it isn't quite literature, but 2 years ago, we launched the first song for clean air. And it was a Pakistan-India collaboration. It took 2 years to do because we had to overcome a lot of hurdles of permission between the two countries. The lyrics were written by a poet from Hyderabad, India, who also lives in New York, Mir Ali Hussain. And they're written really in a very lyrical, poetic way. The voice is Pakistan's leading vocalist, Zeeb Bangash. And the music was composed and produced by Shantanu Moitra. It's called Saaf Hawa Haq Hamara. It is on Spotify and YouTube and Vimeo and a range of platforms. We were unable to actually promote it to the extent that it deserves because we didn't want to put the artists at the mercy of the kind of negative troll social media in both countries. But we will be doing a relaunch at COP30 in Brazil because we are commissioning a song from Africa along the same clean air. And also, I'm looking actually for a good Native American performer because we want to really bring that sort of connection to the land in that vocal tradition. And just to sort of add something from today, from the New York Times, I read a poem which I would like to just end with a few lines. The poem is called Hackberry by Cecily Parks. And I won't read the whole poem. I will just read a few lines from it. A place I love is about to disappear. When the summer sunset drives into the west side of our house, burning with the heat we've been warned about. I look out the 2 square windows that are filled with hackberry leaves, whose greens vary according to light and wind, and whose shade composes a sort of room for us under the tree. Tomorrow, a crew will cut it down. Some people call a hackberry a junk tree or a trash tree. Throwing shade, I love the tree's shade, and now it will be gone. How do I write this poem, I ask my family as we sit together in the disappearing room.
How beautiful and how thought-provoking. Thank you for sharing that with us.
So, you know, as a scientist, this is always a bit tricky for me in terms of balancing the importance of nonfiction and fiction, because you don't want to conflate the two as well when it comes to consequential issues with reference to, you know, basic laws of nature. So what I've tried to do is, like, when most of my writing is nonfiction, but I try to bring in literature and epigraphs and usage in my books. And one of the things I've been very concerned about, I've taught environmental studies for 20 years at various American universities, and a lot of our students, and this is true in Pakistan as well, they're not as interested in the real foundational science, you know, understanding. Like if I ask them what are the 4 fundamental forces of nature, there are people who are majoring in the sciences and they would be like, oh, really? I'm not sure. So one of the things I tried to do, and this is from this particular book which I wrote called Earthly Order, and the subtitle is How Natural Laws Define Human Life. It's really aimed at bringing that foundational knowledge to to everyone. And I've got a Pakistan edition for this, which it was published by Oxford University Press in the US, but also in Pakistan. And all the royalties I'm donating actually for environmental education in Pakistan, because it's such a, it's such a challenge for me that we have all these young people who are interested in engineering basically to get good jobs, but they have a very shallow understanding of the basics of science. And you can't understand climate change until you really understand what are tipping points. Why is it, like, I had a really rare opportunity to visit Antarctica recently. And in Antarctica, when you see that the Antarctic ice sheet is melting, and you will reach a tipping point, after which you will get positive feedback loops, which will not be reversible on human timescales. How do you make them actually understand that? And so you do that through giving that foundational knowledge. But then I do try to bring in literature as well. So I've got Christopher Marlowe is in the epigraphs, and I've got, all that kind of thing. But in terms of Urdu literature, unfortunately, there isn't that much direct environmental literature in Urdu or in our other local languages, but there is a lot of pantheism. Like, one of the Urdu poems we often use in introductory texts in Pakistan for most elementary schools is Iqbal's poem, Ek Arzu. Some of you may know, and the Ek Arzu, everyone reads it, but it's not interpreted in environmental terms, even though it is very much an environmental poem. It's about his desires, he's kind of disenchanted with living in cities, and he wants just the solitude of being out in a very pristine location. So you may remember, I'll just read the first two stanzas. Dunya ki mehfilon se ukta gaya hu ya Rab, kya lutf anjuman ka jab dil hi buj gaya ho, and so on. You'll remember just from that, many of you are Pakistani origin, will have read it in school. But most of the poem, the rest of it, you go down, and it's got a very strong environmental theme. But when we were taught it, that was never really there. There was no environmental ethics linked to the teaching. So that's the kind of thing we need to bring in. With Pakistani dramas, we have great messaging which is being done around women's rights, about child abuse, but not about environmental themes. And in fact, I suggested to Mehreen Jabbar, whom many of you would know, that, this is something we should do. And she said, how do we convince Hum TV to do it? And she said, I would be very happy to do it. Her dad's a great environmentalist. But how do we convince the Sultana Siddiquis and all these people? So this is the challenge, we have.
Yeah. No, thank you, Saleem. I think one way to do it is to have a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law talk about climate. Maybe that might work. I wonder why the TV productions won't take it. They use awful lot of water when they have to show an episode with rainfall. And, they have people dancing around the trees. I mean, environments everywhere in this, in Lollywood and Bollywood, whatnot. But, this is where we're trying to embrace the storm. The idea of building knowledge, which you pointed out, how do you build that, it seems like it's a nimble concept in some parts of our society, but it's very much not, is to train your teachers, your mentors, and then to the students. So it's like many scales of engagement that's required. So you build the knowledge, you raise awareness, and that's what we are trying to do here. But when we're talking about storytelling, we're talking about art, I go back to the exhibit because it's fantastic. It does that through a visual medium, by photographs, and by just making you a part of it through its interactive tools to see what we are talking about here. One thing in storytelling that I do want to point out before we go to the audience is the gender-climate nexus. This has been extremely affected when you bring the stories of women, the marginalized groups, and children from whether it's the Pakistan floods of 2022 or from the Bangladesh cyclones or the tsunamis that the region has experienced. You see women on the front lines, and their stories have been particularly moving, and we need to be telling more and more of them, whether it's through art, whether it's through science, whether it's through diplomacy. Now, if you have any questions, and we've got the mics ready for you, please do raise your hand and introduce yourself and keep the question very brief. We've got one hand there and we've got one hand there. So that gentleman in a brown jacket.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My name is Akbar Noman. I teach at Columbia University here. The question is to do with this issue of the rapid melting, also I understand, of the glaciers of the Himalayas, initially leading to major floods, and then after a certain tipping point, major droughts. They will not have water. Could you comment on that problem and how severe it is and how much window do we have left before we reach tipping points?
Yes, so certainly the Himalayan glacial melting is one of the issues that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has identified as one of the major hazards for the most highly populated part of the world, essentially, right, which is South Asia. And so there are several aspects to it. There's the challenge of immediate disasters. You have this phenomenon called glacial lake overflow floods, where the melting creates these, people in Pakistan have seen Attabad Lake, which now has become a real favorite of YouTubers, and they go and show like all the drones flying over. But it's actually, it's a situation, it's a climate change related phenomenon, where you had this kind of landslide which happened due to glacial melting and created this lake where there was no lake previously. So you have those kinds of phenomena, and then the main concern is if snowfall patterns will change. We depend on water from glacial melt to irrigate our lands, and that, because it's an agrarian society largely, that's going to have an enormous impact. And we won't be able to manage the water. At times when you need it most, you may not get it, and you may get it when you don't need it. And so a lot of engineering is being suggested around it. So it is a very serious issue. And then a related issue with South Asia is that we have a battlefield in part of that area, the Siachen Glacier, sadly. We've got very little science going on. One of the things we've been calling for is we can't do much field work up in the Karakoram glaciers because of the fact that it's a battlefield. So the Siachen is the world's second largest non-polar glacier. It's it's a very special glacier, actually. And you can't have any science there right now, because on both sides of the border since 1986, there has been an armed conflict. And one of the things we have been arguing for, many of us who work on science diplomacy, is that we should think about forming some kind of a science-related peace park in that region. And it would be very similar. And it's not something that's so pie in the sky. People think, oh, this guy is totally utopian. But if you think about Antarctica, where I was telling you about in my recent visit, Antarctica is governed by an international treaty, the Antarctic Treaty. When was that negotiated? In the 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States were at loggerheads and were pointing nuclear missiles at each other. But they did cooperate on science. They were willing to establish the Antarctic Treaty. So we can do it. It's not that if we put our minds to it, we can do it despite the other differences. So your question is very well taken. I think there are many aspects to it which we need: more science and better regional cooperation.
Thank you, Saleem. And I think, thank you for bringing that point up. And we should have talked about it earlier also, for the importance of coupling science and policy. For a region that is so bent on marriages, I think one marriage that we need to make happen is of science and policy in climate. But we have another hand there, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amna. I'm a management consultant, and I'm from Karachi. And my question is, I know you were talking about all this highbrow policy stuff, but at the urban level, right? I'm from Karachi. I went to school in Sadr, and I sat outside my school for 10 years in poisonous bus fumes, inhaling that, right? So has there anything been done in terms of maybe controlling urban pollution, maybe congestion pricing, like London's done congestion pricing, New York has created some spaces. And obviously we can't, it's a different population. Obviously people need to get to work in Pakistan. Public transport is not that great. But has something more sort of immediate been done to contain urban pollution?
So in Pakistan, based on 2018 data, because that's another issue in terms of getting data, 43% of air pollution in cities is coming from the transportation sector. And it's largely due to low quality transportation fuel, because we are still using diesel and Euro 2. We are not anywhere near the kind of fuel standards that we have here in New York. So what has been done, and this was done 2 governments before, which was during Imran Khan's government, they had put forward an electric vehicle policy. The Minister for Climate Change put it through the cabinet. However, his own cabinet colleague, the Minister of Industry, said, but we have to exempt the 4-wheelers for 5 years. And the reason is because the owners of the 4-wheelers, which is cars and larger 4-wheelers, have invested too much in producing the internal combustion engine cars, and they will lose too much money. So the result was that the policy was put forward for 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. So the law is there on the books. There is an exemption that is sitting there. We're still in that 5-year period, but this government has the chance to say this is such a national health crisis that we are going to get rid of the exemption. The technology, of course, is there, both across the border. It's there because they've got electric vehicle manufacturers across the border. We can also do, with the Chinese, an agreement under CPEC. China has electrified, the majority of its transportation systems. It's a question of what are we willing to ask for, what are we willing to invest in, and what are we willing to push for. And in this, the citizens have a role as well. The other thing is in Sindh, the government has moved to start the first electric bus system in Karachi. And actually, I got a chance to sit in one of them. It was such a dream to be going up that main drag in this cool, air-conditioned, silent bus where it was running, on an electric charge. But that, of course, is all, again, a huge investment in systems. So I think we have to push for it. And Pakistan has that capacity. We don't need to ask for coal plants from the Chinese. We can ask for electric vehicles. We can ask for solar to be expanded. So it's a question of what you are going to push for in terms of policy.
And just to highlight what Shazia is saying, there's a lot of this conspiratorial rhetoric about the fog and the smog in Pakistan that, it is, Diwali that's blowing it. Or there's some people who will say, nahin ji, wo sare kisan jo bhusa jala rahe hain, uski wajah se. The FAO has done a pollution audit, and most of the smog is related to particulates from transport. So we have the data. So don't blame the farmers or the Diwali crowd and all. It's the pollution comes from the city transport problem to a large degree. There are some from other sources, but most of it is from there.
Which raises this important point that, even when you have implementation in phases and small scale, it needs socialization. You need to show people how things work and make them start using it. When demand increases, there's a push for supplies.
See, the other thing is when China was looking at the same transition in 2013, they planned, of course, now they are not a democratic country. They can make a decision at the Politburo and the entire country has to follow. But they did 3 things which had to be done simultaneously. They expanded the public transportation by thousands of kilometers, both intra-city and across cities. So that their goal was to reduce the number of private vehicles from 400 million to 250 million. And they met that target last year. So, the issue is expanding your public transportation, being a country where the definition of a developed country, is where the rich take public transportation, like we are living in New York. So this is the goal for South Asia, which is a very hard goal, but we have to go in that direction. We have no choice.
You feel very rich because you take public transport every single day. We have one question here. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Hi, Zara Jamshed. I'm a technology strategist by profession, but chemical engineer and advanced tech persona by education. So excellent conversation, but I would just say, based on what we are viewing throughout the world, Greta Thunberg She had to take a very long trip to create awareness. Yuval Noah Harari, 21 Lessons of the 21st Century. The guy went before the Ukraine war and said to the world, you're getting into this war, you're investing in all this, ammunition and everything, taking money away from the resources that could be invested in climate change. So is it the awareness that we are missing, or is it the lack of resources that we are not investing? Because it's not the story of only South Asia. The ignorance lies here in the US spectrum, top-down, bottom-up. And you mentioned yourself, basically the politicians are just using that as an anchor to even basically fight against each other or create more rifts there. So there is no, I would say, unified formula for any region here. What's your take about basically resources versus awareness versus a combination?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think Harari has that much legitimacy claiming that now, because, he's supporting the military-industrial complex waging the current war in Gaza. I have admired his writings. I have no problem with his writings. I have collaborated with Israeli scholars, but right now he doesn't have legitimacy. With reference to your other point about the role of young activists like Greta Thunberg and how we balance the local versus the global, you need both. There was this famous aphorism when I was an undergrad, they'd say, think globally, act locally, right? I think it's a useless cliche, because you have to think globally, act locally, think locally, act globally. You have to multitask, because we are living in a world of complex systems. I approach environmental issues as a complex system. When you have a complex system, you don't have the luxury of having, नहीं जी ये local level पे बेहतर है, नहीं ये तो लोग जी बहुत ऊंची बात कर रहे हैं, इनको क्या पता. You need to do both. वो ऊंचे लोगों का भी आपको उनका भी ध्यान देना है, और जो grassroots कर रहे हैं वो भी करना है. You have to find convergence between the grassroots and the top down. And I think that can be done. It seems daunting, but we have now the wherewithal, we have the technology, we have just information management resources, which can allow you to do both local and global.
So I think it's a combination in the sense that awareness now exists everywhere, because, there's no place that is escaping climate change. The money also exists. It's just that only 10 to 15% of that money is in government coffers. The bulk of it is in the private equity markets. It's in the pension funds. It's in the hedge funds, etc. And those are still getting invested in the gas, oil sector. And by the way, I hate the word natural gas. There's nothing natural about cracking the earth to get gas. So we have to move to a situation where we have to, as citizens, as well as voters, as well as investors, begin to look at the entire picture of how we are running both our personal lives as well as our economies. So take a look at your own portfolio, see where you're invested, and push your bankers.
No, I completely agree with what the two of you have said, and and something that you'd also pointed out and build on what they both have shared is it's a sum of many things. That is what climate action is. It's a sum of activism. It's a sum of policy. It's a sum of science. Some of what you do on your daily lives. How do you make slight changes? Turning off lights. What do you do for environment? Not only just on Earth Day. Not only just on World Water Day, specified day. It's like just not wishing somebody Happy Mother's Day because it's just the day. No, you have to celebrate the year round. That's the love you have for your mom. So likewise, you have to have the same love for your planet and the environment. It's something that probably most of us will agree to, but it's a bit hard to crack the structures that, unfortunately, where the decision-making takes place. We're a minute down. We can get one more question, perhaps, very quickly. Can we have a mic here, right in the front row, second row? Thank you, dear.
Hi, I'm Kindil Ishtaq. I'm the software engineer.
Put your mic up.
I will keep it short, but I wanted to ask, how do we rally the local communities that are faster at adopting climate-friendly solutions than because over here we see a lot of suspicion towards adopting climate change tools, but in Pakistan there was this one person I met in Islamabad, he's from Thur, and he wanted to get help from me because his community was rallying to build a well, but they wanted to power it with solar panels, and they wanted to get money not for the well, but to get the solar panels, because per plate they were around 20,000 rupees or 30,000 rupees at the time. And I was just amazed that the community was putting funds together and not relying on the PPP government at the time. And I thought it's someone who is not being educated on these are the solutions, but they were much faster at getting a solution to figure out how to be climate friendly, but also help their community get water. So how do we make sure that right now we support that action much faster? Because I think that can really push forward these solutions and can really push forward that.
So how do we support grassroots communities to tackle some of their challenges? Can you take us home very quickly, Shazia?
Yeah, very quickly. First of all, I think you should all be writing to the Pakistan Prime Minister because they're about to put a tax on solar. With great difficulty, we removed it, and now it's about to go back on. So that's number one. And yes, I think that there are small-scale solar is one way out of this crisis for local communities, for which one has to do local fundraising as well as international fundraising.
And we'll get together later and talk a lot about water. But thank you very much. This has been wonderful. I also request you to stay in touch with the Asia Society. We do a lot of work on climate policy, especially in South Asia. So stay tuned and stay engaged. Thank you once again. Thank you.